I welcome everyone to this session where we'll be exploring wellness in the built environment. I want to thank Anne Robertson here and Toxic Free Futures for Our Children as the co-conveners of this session. Thank you so much for putting this wonderful together today that will include Michelle Barnes, the Executive Director of the Helen R. Walton Children's Enrichment Center, Bob Berkebile, co-founder of BNIM Architects and Heartland P5, John Pareto, founder of Verde Capital Resources, David J. Lewis, co-founder of LTL Architects and Dean of the School of Constructed Environments at Parsons, and a collaborator with the Healthy Materials Lab at Parsons, and Anne Robertson, founder of Toxic Free Future for Our Children and vice president of Robertson Stevens. I'm going to hand it off to Anne shortly to frame up this session a little bit more. But our real intent today, we have a lot of other sessions today that are looking at other angles of building materials. How do we build materials that conserve energy? What types of building materials can be most agile in contexts of natural disaster or displacement? And oftentimes we find ourselves looking at one dimension and not necessarily the whole. And this particular case today, we're focusing through that lens of wellness in the built environment. But I think as we'll discover through today's discussion, it's much more than that. It really involves looking through a whole systems lens to really look at how we define wellness within this context. So looking forward to hearing from each of these projects around how they've dealt with this inquiry around bringing wellness into the built environment. Before passing it over to Anne, I also wanted to thank again our co-convening partners for Open Future Forum. In addition to Toxic Free Futures for Our Children that helped put together this particular session, I'd like to thank the American Sustainable Business Network, Bluefin Investment, Eco Restoration Alliance, El Puente, Global Unity, the Guild of Future Architects, Heartland P5, Imagine World, the Institute of Ecotechnics, Intergen Family, Kinship Earth, North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University, Partnerships for Change, Pro Social World, Reconsider, Toxic Free Futures for Our Children, and Triangle Foundation. So about more people, more co-conveners than we have in this room right now. That's the power of collaboration. Handing it over now for a few brief remarks from Anne Robertson to help frame this session.
Great. Well, thank you, Caitlin, and thank you to all the panelists as well for joining. And and the work that Open Future Coalition is doing is quite remarkable in bringing together just so many parts of the system that is, now at this particular moment in time, I think the time to collaborate on quite a large scale with the tech platform, I think this makes it very possible. And so just to give you a little bit background on myself, I founded Toxic Free Future for Children 2 years ago to really bring attention to health and the well-being of children in particular, and the connection with the proliferation of toxic chemicals in our everyday environment, including the built environment. I've been discovered this when I was a young mom, over 25 years ago, with a infant and 2 toddlers, and had moved into a house, unbeknownst to me, that I discovered several weeks later, not years, that 3 people in that household had died of cancer. Oh. And that's where it, and instantaneously alarm bells went off. And I wanted to know, was there something in that house that could have caused the cancer? This is 26 years ago, so there was no internet. There was nothing to Google back then. So I just did my own sort of investigation, asking and talking to as many people as possible. Then it was several years later, it was just about 2 years later, that I met the executive director of a nonprofit became Healthy Child, Healthy World. It was started by parents whose tragically only child died of a non-genetic form of cancer at age 5, later linked to pesticide exposure. That the discovery sent the parents on a discovery journey, and what they uncovered really shocked them, and that's what led them to create Healthy Child, Healthy World. And that is where I started to make the connections between just everyday household products, that cleaners, cosmetics, many things in our everyday life have direct links to carcinogenic materials, have carcinogenic materials. So from that awakening, I would say, I spent many years being on boards and learning from some of the best and top researchers, scientists in this field. And it was, as I said, 2 years ago that I started Toxic Free Future for Our Children. But it was really inspired, quite honestly, by the work of meeting John Pareto and the work he has done in creating one of the healthiest buildings in the state of Texas, School of Nursing building, which was 20 plus years ago. But hearing these stories of people in the pioneering era of the green building movement, Bob Berkebile, of course, being one of the first pioneers to bring about this awareness of green building, and it just keeps growing. And then just before starting Toxic Free Future for Our Children, I met Michelle Barnes from the Helen R. Walton Center. I was invited to a fundraiser and discovered there that they were just about to open the first toxic-free early childcare center in the country. And that was the work that they have done with LTL Architects, Parsons School of Design. And what's really exciting is how we're not only doing all the green building, but the building health into removing some of the most toxic chemicals in the built environment. And that has, I think it's opened a door that is just continuing to grow. So Caitlin, who would you like to go next?
Next, we're going to hand it over to Michelle Barnes. Michelle, again, is the Executive Director of the Helen R. Walton Children's Enrichment Center.
Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. As Anne kind of teed off the project, let me share a little bit about what led us down this path to begin with. We've been in business since 1982, and we realized that it was time to either renovate or build a new facility. And we had, thankfully, enough large donors in the community that saw the vision and was behind the idea of building a new campus. So as we began to look at this project, about that time, we had 2 children that were diagnosed with cancer. What was so unique about this is that both children and associated families had hereditary testing done. And it showed that the different types of cancer that they had nothing to do with genetics, but rather likely was environmental driven, which then caused me to pause and go, wait a minute, what about our environment could be triggering something to this caliber? We had not even begun the design process. At that point, we were invited to participate in something called Design Excellence, and had the opportunity to meet 5 leading architect firms across the nation. One of the things during that process is we knew that we wanted to build a healthy environment, and we were just at the beginning stages of understanding what does that look like. and not so much focused on, yes, the environmental aspects. Energy efficiency was very important to us, but it was really about the health of the young child. And we had already gone through 4 of the interviews, and all we kept hearing was about LEED certification until we met David Lewis. And their firm immediately connected with the project. And there began the history. And it was interesting, as it was supposed to be a more of an interview process. The next thing I know, we were really beginning the design process during that interview, which was amazing. But he really did connect with the idea that we needed to eliminate certain types of toxins from the ground up with this campus. On top of it, this is not something that's typically done in Northwest Arkansas. So we were very lucky to also collaborate with Naples Construction, who was willing to take on this type of project and understand that they had to source products differently. And then how to manage all the subs to ensure that the right types of products were coming onto the campus. Then we had that next stage. Great. We've really had the opportunity to eliminate or reduce 6 classes of chemicals in the construction process, but now how do we begin to outfit this particular campus? Thinking about everything from bottles, dishware, toys, carpeting, just everything that the child comes into contact with. And if we think about young children, birth through 5, everything goes to the mouth or is absorbed through their skin at a much faster rate. And of course, underdeveloped lung and immunity systems. And so it really puts these young children at risk. We were very blessed. We did a tremendous amount of research, really found that there was no large retailer selling to early education that really met our needs. We wound up working with over 90 vendors to bring in all the materials that we needed that were considered healthier options on the marketplace. So fast forward 4 years, and what are we doing today? The goal was not to hold on to this information or just to benefit the children that are served at the center, but how do we look at this from a community aspect to a national aspect? And right now, we have partnered with the EPA and are doing a pilot project here in Northwest Arkansas to test air quality and programs before and after specific changes that we'll be focusing on. And this is where we partnered also with EcoHealthy Childcare, which is a national group that has been in this arena for quite some time as it relates to early childhood education. Our ultimate goal is then to take this at the national level. And how do we share all those lessons learned? And remarkably, even from in that 4-year period, well, actually it's been more because from the day of design forward, so much has changed within this area. And so every day is a learning opportunity for us as well. What are better products? What could we be doing differently? Matter of fact, we just went through air sampling and to figure out what is in our air and how can we think about building maintenance, pest management, all of these steps differently as we go through this. And then how do we share those lessons with the hundreds of thousands of early ed programs across our nation? So that's really what we're working on today. But I'll let David talk a little bit about when his time comes about the actual project and how they really tackled that in conjunction with Naples Construction and all the subs.
Thank you, Michelle. Let's hand it right over to David.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm going to see here. I'm going to be able to share a portion of the screen, so just a second. So otherwise, if I do the whole screen, the entire thing will collapse. Thanks for your patience on that. All right. So I'm just going to follow in some ways on what Michelle had already talked about and give visual keys to it. Essentially do a kind of visual version, because I think one of the things that's really exciting about being able to engage the project is precisely what Michelle ended at, which is this was not just a one-off, but it was really setting up processes and setting up an approach that we really want to be able to expand out. And so forums like this give that opportunity to be able to talk not only about what the goals were, but some of the challenges along the way and things that can still be done. Just to give you a sense of the project, and one of the things that is really key is that began the project really, it's not just about materials, it's about planning. And the planning of the project starts, as you can see here, from pure square footage, that we have almost as much outdoor space as we do indoor within a secure environment. And that's really key to thinking about the overall approach. The prior building was here, and we were locating in a new location very close to Crystal Bridges, so it's a really important site. And the general diagram, and it's important to sort of talk about this, that we wanted an efficient building. So it's not just about material choice, but how does it actually work with the person who's running it and serving it? And Michelle, I think you're in the building right now, if I'm not correct, in terms of, I think you're actually right here, my guess.
Yes.
To take for 240 kids, we want to be able to not have long corridors, but always be able to see daylight. So that was the key, is to break it into 4 wings and have 21 classrooms, each organized according to the site, and having central gathering place, the kind of gross motor rooms or indoor playrooms. In addition to that, we also wanted to be able to provide a security area for kids when they go outside, and then push that security zone on the inside so that it actually acts like a sculptural figure, because we're right next to Crystal Bridges. So this is going to be seen in that broader urban context. And then treat these kind of security pieces as almost a playful entrance, so that the whole building takes on that quality. That it's not just thought about as one piece, but it's an organic whole. And from the entrance, you really start with a sense of delight that you're entering into something that's a little bit different. That is, in fact, a home away from home from many of the children that are here that are going to be in their waking hours in this facility a substantial amount of time. The basic organization is these 4 wings with a kind of central heart, and that the classrooms themselves are really homes. So we decided to design them as though they were homes in the shape of a house. And that goes from the entrance all the way into the inside. The front of the classrooms are 21 different species of trees, all native, so that from the beginning, someone understands where you're at and what's the natural condition that surrounds it. So a shot of the different end conditions, all made locally, working with a custom local timber and mill worker. So you can see the white pine way, and that's then the name of the classroom. So you try to fold this at multiple levels, not just in terms of material, but actually what's the experience for the child. And here are other example, live edge as well as end grain. On the inside house shape is all wrapped in wool. So it brings the scale of this building down. So it's at the child's experience, but equally you have a real great access to the outside. And so that outside shape extends out to this outdoor secure, but outdoor play area, so that you can get messy, do things with, that aren't purely on the inside, but it's also part of a security area. So that can be really an extension of the classroom. A fairly substantial area are 3 different play areas, and those play areas are all framed by the houses of each of the classrooms. So it looks like a neighborhood. So each of the playscapes have a kind of neighborhood feel to them, designed for each of the ages as they go up. You can see this in this case. But really the focus, as Michelle had said, is on the health of the children. Like, how do you actually design healthy through the material selection as well as the spatial organization? And this really does look at early childhood development and the capacities for material risk and long-term consequences, not just on the child, but on the mother as well. And what are the routes of bodily intake? How does that then impact, at what level, and where are the material choices? But it's important to recognize that it wasn't just a material choice. And we worked very closely with the Healthy Materials Lab in this research. And they had a researcher working in our office and to make sure that transition from their understanding into this project is in the material level. So it's not just in the design, it's actually in how we're going to implement that construction and then the maintenance down the line. So you can design the best project, but if the contractor is not going to execute it, doesn't mean anything. And if then the maintenance of it doesn't live up to that expectation. So you have to think about it in the broader sense of the entire project. And so we really look closely at a kind of material approach that drew from the 6 classes of chemicals, seeking to eliminate or minimize to the extent these known classes at the key areas where children come in contact, where it would come into their bodies, and embedded in the specifications so that it's in the requirements of the project. It's then pulled into the construction strategies, which meant that we had to build a partnership, in this case with Nabholz, so that they would understand those goals, understand where the risks are, particularly in bringing in materials that are not expected, substitutions done at the last minute because someone couldn't get that material, they would get another one, but those were not going to be allowed. But to partner with them in collaborative meetings early on in the process, before we went to bid, working at the bidding stage, saying this is really important. If you're not interested in this, don't bid on this project. You have to be committed to these principles and bidded to the broader idea of the children, carrying that through in terms of the execution meetings and then onto the site. And let me give you 2 examples where this then comes up, which is we had the contract Nabholz saying, we've got a concern. We've got chalk lines that we put down on a building, but we typically spray them with crystal clear enamel. Is that going to be a problem? Is that going to be? And so we had a partner who was doing inspections along the way saying, this is an issue. Same thing with early spraying on Tectum. They said it comes pre-finished, but that's not going to meet your specification. It's like, okay, don't buy that. Buy the virgin one, and we'll spray it on site with Roma Bio, which is not a latex base, but a mineral based paint system. So this, as Michelle had said, goes to the classroom supplies. The Parsons Healthy Materials Lab worked to be able to really look at all the toys, all the way down to the fact that we had art materials that are natural based, Legos that are made out of wood and bamboo, not plastic, and then all the kitchen equipment. So it's throughout the entire project where anywhere it would impact kids, and then featuring and focusing upon a garden area so that you understand the full life cycle of where the food comes from as part of the educational endeavors. I think the key thing here is that this isn't just a one-off project, but we really wanted to build out a series of pamphlets, all of them available, and to play it out as a replicable model for education and dissemination. So forums like this are fantastic for us to be able to talk about this and to talk about how this was done as a collective group effort to be able to build the healthiest project we could at the time for this community, and more broadly as a model for early childhood education centers moving ahead.
Thank you, David. Thank you both for sort of so seamlessly expanding upon that model, and looking forward to now leading into a couple others before our discussion. Handing it off next to John Pareto to share some perspectives from another lens of your work through the Texas Medical Center and the School of Nursing, as well as how you're now bridging that through financing. So handing it over to you, John.
Okay, thank you. I'll begin with my 38 years experience in healthcare higher education. That includes hospital administration as the chief hospital administrator, an unusual position for an accountant, which is my training, education, and background at the time, actually an auditor, which my wife referred to me as an ankle biter. So that led me to the Texas Medical Center ultimately, and upon the first year of my new position, I learned that we had a sick building. I was unfamiliar with that. that happened to be the largest building in our facility inventory. It was the medical school building, 850,000 gross square feet, built by 3 different contractors over a short period of time. And within actually 3 years of opening the doors, the building was declared a sick building by the Texas State Health Department, followed by recognition as the second most expensive operating facility in the state of Texas. Utilities alone, and this was in 1980, were over $5 million per year for that building. So we had 2 distinctions. To cure the sick building was going to take $40 million, which was greater than the cost of the original construction. So to begin with, I looked at 3 points, and that's what I wish to leave this group with. First of all, because of my comfort level with financial models and accounting, we developed our own financial information management system. That allowed us to streamline our processes, to move financial management to employees closest to the actual decision-making and operations. So they were understandable. They were, to use my term, simplified, so that they would invite questions from the audience that we were presenting to and the staff that was actually going to live by these financial reporting mechanisms established in this system. The positive side of this, after getting it developed within 1 year and operational, is that we later sold 125 of these systems around the country to other institutions of higher education and healthcare. We actually generated more royalty money than all of the faculty physicians combined. So that was the beginning. That led me to think about what we would do with our other existing buildings and new buildings. And I started with the green building concept, and I had 3 parties involved: the external architects and engineers. Actually, that was led by Bob Berkebile, who will follow me in this presentation. On the ground, I had 2 key people: my plant operator, physical plant operation vice president, and a chief architect. They were on the ground every day with our nursing school building construction. We all participated in the planning of that facility for, I think, roughly a year. My role, which was probably the easiest role of all, I was on the ground early in the morning and late in the afternoon, and in between, worked with educating or informing our board in corporate administration about why we were doing a building in this fashion. So we were kind of in a bind, in the sense that our board didn't want to see excessive costs for a new building. So we kept it at what was considered at that time the normal construction cost for a facility of this size, 195,000 gross square feet, and purpose for education, research, and service. I then was able to add 4% to that number. The board accepted that. We recovered that additional 4%, I believe, in 2 to 2.5 years, just from energy savings. We had faculty and staff of that building who actually believed that their productivity had increased tremendously. Now, this was in the first year after opening the doors. Later, my wife and I just dropped in the facility, talked to a few existing faculty members with their doors open by a big, large atrium where we had natural daylighting. And it's unusual for an administrator to get complimented in that setting, but he was so pleased with his impact, the impact the facility had on his productivity. Still, we didn't measure it effectively, but we had it there. The students, instead of going from school to another place for coffee, which I will not mention, they stayed within their community center, the existing building that was the School of Nursing. So they didn't have to leave. Those who were not in the School of Nursing actually came from the medical school and joined in the School of Public Health, all communicated with each other and had their coffee in this little community center that we had in that building. So now well, let me back up a minute. In order to do this, and why it took substantially longer than I would have liked, is you truly had to build an environment of trust. That was key in order to do this. And that was trust not only within the nursing team, but also the medical team, the School of Public Health, and the biomedical sciences, and other administrative personnel that were part of those groups. That took longer than I anticipated. And if I had to do it all over again, and that's where we are now, talking about what's next. What was next for me was being able to help academic health centers actually find the courage, the money, and the systems thinking, if you will, to take on a facility that truly was regenerative, and that it cured, if it was restoration, it cured the problems of the existing building. If it was going to be a new building, it dealt with building that facility in such a manner that it was going to not harm any of the inhabitants or patients that might come forth in to get health care at all. So they wouldn't be in, we wouldn't add to an unhealthy individual coming into the facility. So what I'd like to close with, and something that I feel is important today, in fact, not only important, but critical and necessary, and I wish I'd used these terms back then: better, faster, and cheaper. That is going to be the key to get us to where we need to go, and that can be done with regenerative design and facility construction. But please do not forget creating that environment of trust. But I'd like to leave you with an interesting comment that I found in my notes of many years ago, and that was from Ricardo Simler, President and CEO of Simco. The comment was, "A turtle may live for hundreds of years because it is well protected by its shell, but it only moves forward when it sticks out its head." So I would suggest all of you to think about moving forward. They're risking doing it, but they're minimal compared to what it used to be. And I can say it's an enjoyable process and a lot of fun. And it really, really takes strong team effort to get there. Thank you. I know I went beyond my 7 minutes, Caitlin, so my apologies.
Oh no, that was wonderful. Thank you, John. I really appreciated the way that you illustrated the social and mental well-being effects that a space built with an intention around kind of physical and environmental well-being yielded. And I think that's the perfect lead-in to what Bob is about to share. I'm really looking forward to developing more ways to better measure some of the benefits that you spoke to, that you'd mentioned weren't measured at that time. But as Bob's about to speak to, there are so many different spillover effects that extend beyond the footprint of a building. And so I'm honored to introduce Bob Berkebile of Heartland P5 and BNIM Architects. Bob was also instrumental in the formation of the US Green Building Council and its LEED rating system. So over to you, Bob.
Thanks, Katie. And let me start by celebrating the work of all the previous presenters who have been sticking their necks out for the right reason. I really appreciate that and celebrate the importance of that work. I have to admit, this is going to be very difficult for me because I'm an architect and I really like images. But I'm going to share some concepts. And I want to start by saying that what I'm going to share is a tragic and very common story about the unintended but devastating consequences of obsolete thinking about economic development. And in this case, it takes place in the heartland of America, in Kansas City, Missouri, my home, on the Blue River Industrial Corridor. And I want you, rather than watching me, to think about these environments in your own community. Certainly the ones that have just been mentioned in the last two projects are communities that have this same condition. And most communities I have visited in my life have this condition. So think about how it relates to your neighborhood, your city, your environment. At the turn of the century, the Blue River was famous in this region for the most beautiful river we could find. And it was the center of water sports and recreation. It was the go-to place for people in this region. But it was also a beautiful resource from the point of view of industry. They liked it because there was water. It was very flat around the river, and they could build railroads and utilities and highways very efficiently. And so early on, people like Kansas City, Nut and Bolt claimed the site and built a factory which grew into Armco Steel. Henry Ford decided to put his first factory outside of Michigan here to build Model T Fords. General Motors followed with Fisher Body and Chevrolet. Bendix followed with a large facility to build nuclear weapons for the Department of Defense, and on and on. And all the industries that supported those major industries joined the team, wreaking havoc in our community, taking away the playground and replacing it with serious contamination. I think it's important to know that when this was all happening, everyone in this area thought of this as a center for innovation and certainly was the economic engine for our region, providing thousands of jobs. 8 neighborhoods were created on the borders of this river and its new industrial zone to house all the workers that filled those jobs and provided the productivity. But in the 60s, something new happened, and that was suburban communities started reaching out with new financial incentives and tax incentives to these large industries to motivate them to relocate, which in less than 2 decades, all the large ones did relocate. They took their jobs with them, but left behind these 8 neighborhoods without jobs and left behind a Superfund site, more brownfields than we can count, and a host of other serious problems. Today, decades later, in spite of numerous master plan studies, economic incentives, the pattern of decline persists. And last year, the Industrial Development Authority, Think Bonding Agency, gave my organization, one of my organizations, Foundation for Regeneration, a grant to take a new look at this history and this specific place and try to look for ways to break this vicious, destructive cycle. The Foundation for Regeneration, I should say, is a relatively new organization founded by 2 of us, my partner, Brian Weinberg, who's a financial genius and specializes in blended finance and impact capital. He came to us as being the chief operating officer of Nexus, but I'm delighted we captured him. And then I'd say Brian is a 30-something person. As you can see, I'm probably 50 years his senior. So it's a multi-generational focus on finding a new system to renew this incredible resource for our community. Our funder decided they couldn't provide the money and be the client, so they made Economic Development Corp our client, which was a really good choice. And they committed us to taking a deep dive into, as our report says that we've released in April, industry, community, and nature. Ironically, that's kind of in the reverse order that we consider them, but that was what's on the cover. Remember, they're industrial development funder. We started with the natural capital, which we've heard earlier today. That is to say, the environment. We then looked at the social resiliency of these now decimated neighborhoods and the industrial corridor itself, and finally the economy. And we found some amazing things. We did that with the great support of some world-class consultants, including Hoxie Collective, who helped us manage the community dialogue, including Parsons Associates, who helped us manage the dialogue with our elected officials, and Metabolic, an international consultant who has been doing a material flows analysis for us. And B&IM, my architectural firm, who helped us with some images and costing. I should say also, when we went for the grant, we took with us a Nature Conservancy, who committed to doing the research and developing a conservation bank within this river valley, which they have now done the science. They found the site. They're early on in the acquisition and will ultimately restore that site and operate it as a conservation bank. We published our findings in April. We called it the phase 1 report discovery, and it did a variety of things, but it primarily reduced our recommendations to 10 pilots, which are now underway. I'm going to tell you briefly what they are just by name, and I'm only going to describe 4 for time. Economic gardening, site assembly, brownfield grants, community micro grants, seed eco home, and team expansion. The 4 I want to spend a little more time with before I close is a circular economy studio. We found a lot of circular economic activities in the valley, including Ripple Glass, maybe the best glass recycler in the country. They've just been acquired by the largest in the country. That's a clue. Missouri Organics, a composter who has a subsidiary, Urban Lumber, both doing brilliant work throughout the region. And so they, by creating the data that will allow us to understand the material flows, we think we can identify a number of other opportunities that are even larger, that will include things like waste tires, waste plastic, which we're up to our necks in, to develop new industries that are even more powerful than the ones that have already been launched. Another is the municipal farm pre-development. We made an offer before we finished the study to acquire the municipal farm from the city. This is a 440-acre site that is a troubled past with, I would say, extremely bad karma. It's a municipal farm because the farmers were the prisoners in the men's and women's prisons. It has a potter's grave for, we know, more than 3,000 of our community members, unmarked graves. It was at one time the city's toxic waste dump. The Kansas City Star named it Fort Hazard as a result, but we see it as a center for regenerative thinking, for as the best example of urban regenerative agriculture in our region, for the home of a couple of things that I'm going to mention next. But you can hear more about the Regen Ag Initiative here, and we're not doing any of these on our own. We're partnering with other powerful, capable organizations. In this case, Powell Gardens, our botanical garden, 50 miles from the city, is launching, which another one of our foundations is organizing, a regenerative ag program on most of their property. And we will be using their expertise to help create this regenerative ag example, and it will become the home of what we're calling the Kansas City Climate Corps. So think about Roosevelt's Conservation Corps. This is a similar kind of move, except these are people in the neighborhood that we are educating and training to become members of the Climate Corps. They will be doing their restoration in this river valley and elsewhere in the community and region where it's needed. And they will be linked to a new urban ecosystem standard. We found with the USGBC, it had no teeth and no impact until we developed the lead rating system, until there was widespread buy-in to what are the standards we're trying to create, the conditions we're trying to create. So the urban ecosystem standards will do that very thing for the underlying natural capital in this region, and specifically this industrial river valley, including, of course, soil building, carbon sequestration, et cetera. But by measuring it, we're confident that we can sell carbon credit, not only carbon credits, but ecosystem credits for their work to the corporations in our region and ultimately planet-wide. And finally, I think the point I want to make is, and this is something I learned primarily from having the good fortune of working in 12 communities in post-disaster environments. And to the degree we had success in those communities helping them rebuild was the degree to which we managed what I've come to call a collaborative dialogue of discovery. And I think, Katie, it relates to radical collaboration. It's putting everyone in the conversation and exploring the future with arms locked and eyes open and hearts open. But that is critical to this process, and is why we spent so much time listening to the community before we started listening to the land, et cetera. And in addition to that, we selected this damage zone because one of my professors, Bucky Fuller, said failure is the greatest access to dramatic breakthrough. And this is the most failed region and the most failed economic program in the heart of America. And we thought we would start with that failure and see if we couldn't, by thinking differently, create a new regenerative economic and social model for this region. Since I didn't share images, if you want to see them, you're welcome to go to regeneration.us, and you will find there, you can make a request, you can get a copy of the report or our progress, or stay in touch with the work. And some of our colleagues will be on tomorrow for the regenerative ag at Powell Gardens and at the Municipal Farm. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the dialogue.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you so much. When you mentioned your kind of definition of, or the pattern that you referenced around radical collaboration, I was actually tempted to immediately point to those sessions tomorrow. And so I do want to highlight that beyond this discussion, and we do have another about 30 minutes for discussion. And I think we have an opportunity to have a rich one since we have a pretty intimate group here. But I also do want to point to kind of continuing the dialogues around some of what Bob just referenced. We do have a session later this afternoon around funding community resilience that will be continuing some of these threads around how do we resource some of these projects regeneratively. We also have a session tomorrow morning on funding from farm to table that'll be starting to bring together some of these bioregional partners and model that weaving kind of together in real time, followed by a live design charrette tomorrow afternoon that's really looking at how do we actually launch collectively a center for regeneration with some of these projects and these funding mechanisms. And lastly, around some of these models for funding beyond carbon, we have a session on that on Thursday afternoon as well. So I do encourage all of you, even if you popped in for just this one session and you want to explore some of the other conversations. It'll be continuing some of those threads. Make sure that you kind of RSVP'd to the general forum as well, so we can make sure you're on those calendar invites and you can view kind of how to access some of those other sessions. I can pop that into the chat at the end. But I do want to make sure, I know, Gabriel, you said you have to hop in a couple minutes, but I suspect you might have some juicy questions or comments to drop in even before you leave. So opening up the floor now for comments, questions, but especially encouraging those who have to leave at the top of the hour.
Helen, I'll take the opportunity, since you said my name, just to say hello to everybody and to tell you that I'm grateful to have this opportunity to be here with you, even if just for a few moments. So, my work is a little bit oblique to the primary nature of the discussion so far. I work at the intersection of neurophysiology and mindful awareness and indigenous lifeways. And, one of the areas that we've been exploring and focused on is the relationship between the bodily experience of safety and the design of spaces, looking at, for example, the way that it's sometimes inadvertently undermined in hospitals by the humming of machinery, for example, that elicits an unconscious bodily detection of threat in anyone who encounters it, right? So just gratified to have the opportunity to spend a moment here with you today and learning from everything that everybody has shared. It's already touched my heart. So I'll put my contact info in the sign off. I have a meeting I have to engage, but thanks for all the work that you're doing, and I hope to have an opportunity to be with you in a future session. I'll put my contact information off to the side.
Wonderful. Thanks, Gabriel. And I know, Genevieve, you had to run too. So if you wanted to weigh in with anything.
I am jumping ship from here to Kingship, and which there's another Zoom that I'm very interested. So I'm sorry to go earlier. Anyway, let me just introduce myself a little bit. I'm Genevieve. I'm in Italy, Florence, and I am trying to manifest this this sanctuary for the new children. And it should be like the point that I'm getting from you guys is like the things that I should pay attention regarding children, even the normal things that, just before, like when they touch it and put it into their mouth. And anyway, that sanctuary is not only as, in my vision, it's not only a an education center, it's more like an orphanage for children without parent. So, and all information is, is good to receive them. And I thank you so much for everyone. Thank you. And I have to go now, and thank you.
Thanks, Genevieve.
Thank you.
All right. Well, opening up the floor more broadly for any initial reflections or questions that this sparked. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Chris from Sydney. I'm a human and an economist, and for my sins, maybe a reformed investment banker. So it's been a privilege to hear this. So I'm going to ask a broad question, but John, you said something before that really struck me, which was what could be seen as perverse but necessary, which is taking accounting systems and financial information and making them available to people in ways that trigger questions and so forth. And I was really struck by that. And I would love to see the system, but also to take that system, if we can explore how it expresses and is used against the context of what we're talking about here, which is, the costs and the benefits as we measure them in building and evolving and manifesting these systems so that we can get people to understand. And my task in life is to help get capital from people to people by people, using systems like this. So I am excited in this conversation to hear how we can get to learn about those systems as accounting and measurement systems and how they manifest in that scary thing, numbers and data, so that we can help together drive these systems and help people build them for themselves. So that's a prompt, but the direct question, the technical question is, what are the systems? How do we measure? How do we see? I'd love to see the experiences so that we can start replicating those things and helping other people build these sorts of systems. I mean, that's my observation and question. Thank you.
Okay, if I can, I'm going to reflect on my notes, which go back to the early 80s to when I established this. We started by streamlining all of our processes. We looked at all of the various processes that had an impact on our staff. In other words, they didn't see or feel that they knew enough about our systems or accounting to appreciate what we could do to make it easier for them. Their life was miserable when I walked in the door. They managed to do a very good job of convincing me that the first order of business should be to address this topic. I began with organizing our services. I'm going to stay away from the accounting component at the moment, but organizing our services around needs. And we looked at each of the operating units and their particular needs. We asked them to provide us with that. So they they had the opportunity to give us input, telling us what these new financial systems needed to address to assist them in their everyday work life. The other large criticism that came from senior people within the various operating units was they wanted to speed up the cycle time within processes. So what you're hearing from me is all of the processes that underlie the actual accounting systems. And then the final point that I think was probably my best selling point, not taking credit for this myself, but my team, and that was to allow operational decisions to be made by people closest to the users. None of this is something that all of you, most of it you're already familiar with, but it's surprising how many organizations do not rely on that, at least encourage that. Many of them, I believe someone mentioned fear, and it was fear to delegate that. I felt that if we were going to do some of the things that needed to be done to achieve the mission, we needed to change how we think about decision making. That then led to this accounting development of a system that was easily understood. The reports were something that, as I said earlier, invited questions. So it brought a level of comfort to the users who were uncomfortable with the traditional financial reporting mechanisms that we had in place at that time. So as I said, the proudest moment was once we put that in place, once it was developed by the group, the full team, we then were able to, through all of us being on the road talking about this system, we sold 125 of them to comparable organizations. And that was kind of our measure of true success. But it had the system itself, the reporting mechanisms were clean and simple. I don't know any other way to say it. My wife hates the term simplification, which is what I used, because I thought that would truly drive it home and remove the fear and build confidence in the user organization. That's probably more than you want to hear, and maybe I didn't address the specifics of economics and accounting in there, but that's how we developed it.
Thank you. I love that, and I think that what I heard in that was starting with the human need, anchoring in the human need, helping people make decisions personally around their need, and then the tools or whatever help you do that, rather than starting with the measurement and ending with the human as outside. So I would love to see that system if possible, but also want to relate to what Anne was saying and at the very beginning of this conversation about the choices in terms of choosing in the applied problem we've got here to create healthy environments, the data, so we're talking about accounting data, about choices between building materials. I mean, we'll come back to the rehabilitation. So how do we start seeing the choices and what the costs are? I mean, in my fantasy world, we'd have a place where all this information was available and simply accessible so people could see their choices and understand the consequences. I use the term opportunity cost of choices. And to what extent, how evolved are you as a group, we as a group, in developing that kind of knowledge repository where we can see what the physical choices are for building materials and help people make choices in design and along the way? I mean, that's a question to the room because that's what I'm hearing as an observer.
I'd like to chime in a little bit because I'm hearing a real common thread here that's gone across all these topics and discussions. But one of them is, you know, we have these great industrial systems that can do all these different things fast. I mean, Bob, your story of the river and the 12 miles of that industrial district, that was built in 3 years. And it only operated for 3 years, and it was shut down at the end of World War II. And then they did it again in the next 12 miles in 3 years and shut it down in 10. And we've done this over and over, and this is indicative in every city. Just this week, that Blue River in Kansas City has a sister city, a river in St. Louis that flows through Ferguson and Florissant, right on the border. And just this week, we found an elementary school had for 30 years has had just the dust in the air full of nuclear wastes that the kids have been breathing. So as we hear these things, we've always had the ability to do this. We've always had the ability to do the accounting. That's how they've moved the money to do what they do. What we haven't done is accounted for. Mm-hmm. And to do that, you have to put the people in the picture. You have to make them part of the story because, you know, and Caitlin is one of the first persons I had heard say it so eloquently. Money is a story. Mm-hmm. You know, and currency is the will and trust that allows it to flow. And, you know, as we do this, I think the tools are there. The tools are there all over. But the problem is everybody's trying to do the accounting of those tools and trying to turn them into properties rather than community resources, rather than turning them into a way. And I think that is, to me, that's what, when I first saw Open Impact and other people, I was trying to do this with some other technology that didn't have the ethos. You can have the technology, but if you don't have the guidance system and the ethics, you don't account for, you know, and I think that is the power of this, is it allows us to connect all these people who are stuck in those accounting circles in communities that don't account for. It allows us to overcome that separation that is physical, not just geographic. If you look at this whole thing, it is, you know, the physicality is the property of colonization. It is a manifestation that is not real, you know, in reality. And yeah, we have to deal with the realities of every day, and we still got to pay our bills and deal with that world. But the time it's changing, and we have the ability to do that. But I do think the tools are there, and I think a lot of the people in this room can speak more to the specific tools, but it's how you use them. And I don't know if you know Wendell Berry's story of the bucket. You know, but the most important thing we do is collect these stories of our community and our time and grow the soil, and we account for them. We don't just count them, you know, and I think that's, you got to change the guidance system. The tools are there, the resources are there, everything is there to do what we need to do. What's not there is the guidance system. And I think that's what we're all here to help co-design.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. I'm going to take that opportunity to do one more layer of weaving because some of the, you know, the conversation that, well, before I get into the specifics, I will say that, you know, I think that the phenomenon we've seen time and time again, particularly throughout the last century, has been that these projects, our efforts are kind of within our majority of our current economic system kind of made to contort themselves to fit the shape of our capital markets. And a lot of the dialogues that I've been lucky to have with many in this room are around how do we leverage that financial capital as a tool while allowing these regenerative efforts to maintain that shape? How do we create the governance and the other surrounding structures that allow us to do what we are here to do and not have the projects ask, well, how do I need to bend and shape myself to the will of the resource? And how do we do it the other way around? And I will say that quite tangibly, practically, there are examples emerging from the folks in this room around how, around kind of ways that we can take, for example, institutional capital and say, okay, you can sit right there in whatever shape you need, hold on. And we can take tools and infrastructures that allow the projects to do what they're doing. But I see many of us in this room as that bridge that allows us to kind of de-risk, package, whatever word we want to use, simplify, as John likes to say, and kind of reframe the story of what's already happening to then make it visible so that it can access those resources. And one kind of practical next step I see coming even out of the other side of this forum is that there's one dialogue that we've been having with John, with Charlie, with Anne around kind of how do we create some of those guardrails, that guiding system that allows us to make visible and create the community, the knowledge repositories really that are required to collectively advance some of these existing solutions and connect them with those resources. And that very much is a process for quantifying the active production of thriving, for calculating some of these spillover values, making them visible, making them investable. And then on the other side, I do want to bring into the picture that there's a really exciting conversation that we've been having with Chris and his team as well around that other side, around, is there, you know, part of that translation mechanism, there's also this kind of risk engine that's needed in the middle to kind of help us to communicate to that other side. And we've been discussing, well, what convening, if we need to convene on the project side so that we can better kind of identify what's being produced. And then we also need to convene, actually, we have to convene the capitals together, and have that sort of risk quantification as well. And so I'm excited to connect together some of the work of those in this room after this, because I think, as Charlie said, I think we have what we need. It's just time to get doing.
Very exciting.
Yeah, David.
I'm not sure this follows directly on what you're saying, but I've been trying to think of what ties the presentations together. In other words, what produces the brownfield sites in Kansas City, what created the sick building from the beginning after it's built, what provides a situation where we're now you're having to choose less toxic materials, and in many ways, one of the challenges of the built environment that we all inhabit in. So we've always that it has been over the last probably 120 years, the resultant of a shift from materials that were understood as their source to ones that have been produced as products to be sold. And that the shift from known materials, stone, wood, some manufactured materials were mostly iron, and fiber-based materials to ones that go by names that you actually have no idea what's in them. That process, which is involved in commodity and the development of commodities for trading for capital, is in many ways the opaque world through which one needs to now sift through and get back to what I would say is the equivalent to the farm to table in the built environment. In other words, if you don't know if you can't speak the ingredients in the material, you probably don't want it in your kitchen. Right, no more so than Michael Pollan's own claims about if you can't read the ingredients in the food, you wouldn't want to put it in you. And there's a certain level in which we can make this incredibly complex and talk about it in terms of very different, huge systems, but at the core, what's produced the brownfield sites, what's produced the toxic environments in our buildings, is we essentially are producing or constructing our environment in a way that is not only displaced from natural systems, but in fact are run through commodity systems that have its intentional capitalization based upon ensuring that you have no idea what its original source was, but is then built into building codes that you have to use it. So I think this is where I would argue that one of the premises of regeneration, one of the things that ties all these together, is understanding that at a basic level, if you don't know what you're building a project out of, you can't know where it's sourced, how long it's going to temporarily stay in that building, 3 years for a full construction, 10 years, maybe 100 years. It's temporarily stored as a building in indoor cities, and then it will go on to do something else. If you don't know where that full cycle is, you're not tying it into regenerative systems of agriculture, of building, of forestry products, of essentially the transformation of the earth into inhabited systems, then you're failing to meet anything, no matter what criteria you're setting forth. And I think this is where many of the complexities that we tend to produce to be able to see through this system can be really cut through and thought about at a more evidentiary, basic, and common sense level. If you don't know where it's coming from, and you don't know who made it, or where it was sourced, or how long it's going to be there, or where it's going to go, you probably don't want it to have as a building. On the other hand, there are incredible systems that can regenerate and transform the way we're inhabiting the earth, that succeed positively at every level, from the social level to the human level to the material level. And those are the choices that we should be making at the fundamental basis of what future we're building.
Well, I was going to say something about capital. So, and there's 2 or 3 code words that we're using, which are fundamental to the experiment of bringing stuff together. So to bring stuff together, that's built on trust. Change moves at the speed of trust, and capital is trust, because it's vouching into period is built on trust and understanding. And what has happened is that we've got cognitive dissonance in the myth of modernity. We don't know what the inputs are. And frequently what we've got in a world now, which is scared, because if we do know, we won't trust it and it collapses. And so we can see the financial system is on the verge of collapse right now because of climate change, and trust is beginning to move away from the sustainability of things. So we need to find ways to bring people into trust in learning this stuff and having choices that don't make them feel like they're going to contract, but they're going to be empowered to act. So to say what you're saying, David, is, you know, often people don't want to know, because if they do know, they'll realize the cost is greater than what they realize. And then they'll feel, oh, we'll get contraction. And so we're in this sort of catch-22, whereby we need to build a new conversation, and smart money, that expression, has begun to know that it's got it. So they're at a point where I use the expression greed meets need, where trust, they can no longer persist in the old, and everyone's trying to find a way in the new. So we've got to create this information in a way people can trust, and it creates the ability to act. So that's just a tirade. I apologize, but you know, for what Caitlin, how we bring this thing together, it's stories that people trust and want to embrace, and in the trust can act.
Right.
So,
well, David, it'd be great for you to talk about some of the materials and some of the pilot projects that are going from basically, like you said, farm to table, but from farm to, you know, building materials, the hempcrete and some of the other materials that are really exciting.
I think part of it is we tend to think of that you have to build first. You have to go to Home Depot to figure out what to build. So you've already made that choice. And I think so then you're picking between XPS and EPS. So I think what I find really exciting right now is there is a way of going and understanding what has been historically known as traditional building materials, and those are typically plant-based building materials or stone-based building or reuse materials. In other words, the most sustainable building is one that's already built. But now not just understanding in terms of what you're purchasing, but the consequences of what it means to who makes it and what their livelihood will be, and whether or not the livelihood of a truly regenerative material, one that has a full biogenic life cycle to it, actually gives positive feedback all along the way. And this is whether it's using in its finite resource cork from Portugal, whether it's using hemp and the manufactured lime, whether it's engaging in proper focus for timber, using earth, true, not cement-based earth, but earth that's actually properly solidified and understood in terms of how it's going. Where there are ways to really rethink how we build that learn from it, don't have to replicate the aesthetics and forms of the past, but actually look forward to a much more, I think, a much better future. And that's where I think many of the opportunities, and certainly the students I'm working with, they become most excited when you talk about that, not as this doom and gloom, but actually a transformative and
David, I think that's a really important point. And I also think that we have to add how much carbon we can sequester with each project. And that will often mean not building a new building for the next decade. Because even if it's a living building, we can't afford to invest in the embodied carbon it takes to deliver those healthy natural materials to the site and so on. So I think there's some, at least in my mind, some critical new concerns that have to be part of our discovery process.
Yeah. I want to make sure we have an opportunity to hear from all the voices here too. Is there anyone else who hasn't shared yet that has any questions or reflections? I know you were on camera before, Siko, but you may have stepped away. Okay.
No, I'm still here. Just listening in. I mean, the conversation, of course. Yeah, it's I think in my context, the South African context or Durban, where I'm based, maybe I can just share this. So we are working. I'm working in the urban space, and particularly around the vulnerable population that interact with some of the spaces. And working with this population, a heterogeneous population that always in the center of flux, that we term homeless, is the area that we are working with, or the population that we're working with. And we've got to a point where we, as an organization or an entity working in collaboration with the local government, is to say, how do we create safe sleeping spaces for rough sleepers? How do we move people who are sleeping rough on the street and create spaces such as these that you see in front of you in the colorful scheme here, basic temporary shelters that are termed safe sleeping spaces. Now, interesting enough, you are speaking about the material. Now, this is a part that was not included in the bid specification, to say what are we looking at? Healthy materials in terms of the sourced materials, or are we bidding based on the cheapest or the lowest bidder wins and gets the contract? In which, in this case, was what happened. So the materials are not really the primary indicator of whether a contractor is awarded the bid. so having said that, it now begs the question for me now to say, after this conversation and listening into some of the interventions, I think, is it Michelle? Yes, where you're sitting there in David's building, or the children's building. It now raises questions to say, how do we now, because we're saying we're offering a service to a vulnerable population, are we not making them more vulnerable by actually creating another problem altogether, not looking or even considering the health aspect of the materials that some of the contractors have to use? So I have my homework to do in terms of now going back to the local government or the local municipality that we are working with on this project to say, maybe we didn't consider this, and there is an alternative way of doing this. And maybe perhaps as we scale the project, I mean, we haven't broken ground yet, but before we break ground, have we even considered this as a point, so that we start actually looking at new urban solutions? I mean, interesting enough, we in Urban October, what United Nations terms as Urban October. But this, for instance, has never been a consideration for any of the bid specifications that look at social housing, or look at addressing the just temporary housing for low cost needs. And again, around needs, I think the question of deservedness also comes in to say, are we actually addressing what people need, or are we addressing what people deserve? And I think in this instance, because it's social, it's made for the homeless, the approach is that we are looking at whether they deserve better or they deserve access to certain housing. And I think that approach then becomes the can of worms, because we are actually not addressing the need. We're addressing, we are looking at it from an angle of whether these people actually deserve this kind of housing. In fact, it becomes such another issue. But I think I'm really interested in seeing and learning more about the other projects as well, and then learning from the many people that we have in this forum. But besides that, thank you so much for creating the space, Caitlin, and hosting the forum.
Thank you. What a wonderful kind of way to wrap this session. And by wrap, I guess I mean continue kind of into the next one, because we're right after this heading into a bioregional roundtable where we'll be featuring about 9 or so demonstration projects from all over the world that'll expand upon additional models. So I do want to give us some time to transition well into that next session. But I thank you all so much for sharing your work here. I think that this is a model in the beginning of a weaving that then has so much space to continue into new. I think one of the inquiries, for example, we're faced with here is, okay, we have some of these examples, such as the Helen R. Walton Center. What does it look like to bring such a model to scale in a way that's contextually relevant, in a way that keeps in mind all these other ripple effects on natural resources and so on. So I really look forward to continuing to navigate that with you all. Thank you so much for your time here today. We'll be sure to share the recording of this as well. And I know the topic of knowledge repository came up too. We do have a session Thursday afternoon on how do we build dynamic knowledge repositories. So that might be immediately relevant to this conversation as well. So our next session is as I mentioned, this kind of bioregional roundtable with a discussion around kind of sharing learnings, needs, skills, best practices. And so I'm going to put the Zoom link for that next session. We'll be migrating over into a different link for that one. So popping it in right here for those who are interested in joining And again, for even those who joined, who popped into the forum, particularly for this session, we really welcome you to join any other sessions that you find relevant. If you register, I'll make sure that you're added to the calendar invites as well so that you can see the dial-ins for those other sessions. So let's hop on over there and see you soon. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks all.